agencies that are have been attending the meeting online the whole day, and other colleagues and experts that have joined us today. My name is Anna Judic. I work for the UNODC Justice Section at the headquarters, and I'm the focal point on police reform. We wanted to take the opportunity of the meeting of HONLEA being online to organize a side event together with our partners at the African Police Civil Oversight Forum. Sorry. The APCOF is a not-for-profit trust working on issues of police accountability and governance in Africa. APCOF promotes the values which the establishment of civilian oversight seeks to achieve, namely assisting to restore public confidence, developing a culture of human rights, and promoting integrity and transparency within the police, and maintaining good working relationships between the police and communities. Today's HONLEA has focused on a number of substantive issues around specialized challenges that have come up during the COVID pandemic, cryptocurrencies and others, money laundering and so on. However, we felt that it was important to go back to discussing some of the basic policing issues that were present before the pandemic and that have continued existing within many countries around the world, including in Africa. This is why this side event focuses on evidence and human rights-based policing in Africa during and after a pandemic. We want to look at police reform and oversight, use of force, public health responses to policing, and the criminalization of petty offences. We have quite a full agenda of speakers who will look at both the challenge in terms of policing in Africa during and after the pandemic, and then at some answers coming from police officers around from different countries in Africa. So I will give the floor to the first speaker, and hopefully by then we will also have solved any technical issues with our remaining speakers. The first speaker today is Louise Edwards, who is the Programs and Research Director at APCOF. She has spent the past 10 years working on police accountability across Africa, including focusing on provision of technical legal assistance to different organs of the African Union, as well as regional economic communities and national stakeholders. Amongst others, she has led the drafting of a number of important instruments together with the African Commission for Human and People's Rights, such as the guidelines on the conditions of arrest, police custody, and pretrial detention in Africa, the guidelines on the policing of assemblies in Africa, and the common standards for policing in East Africa. Louise will talk about rights-based policing and the decriminalisation of petty offences in Africa. Louise, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I'm just going to share my screen. I've got a PowerPoint to focus the discussion. So good afternoon, everybody. My name is Louise Edwards. I'm the Director of Research and Programs at the African Policing Civilian Oversight Forum. And I'm going to be speaking to you for the next 10 minutes about this issue of the decriminalisation of petty offences, which is becoming something of a kind of a buzz issue when we think about police reform and justice sector reform on the continent, but I think for very good reason. So what I want to explore is why, in the context of sustainable development, Goal 16, including this kind of growing recognition of income inequality and of social exclusion as having a profound impact on the extent to which we're going to achieve sustainable development and some of the targets within Goal 16 around safety and justice, and why in the context of democratic police reform, which has such an emphasis on responsive and accountable policing, an increasing emphasis on evidence-based policing and rights-based policing, and why, in the context of this kind of growing global recognition of things like harm reduction approaches to challenges like the policing of drug use, why, in this context, are we making the poor and people who experience social exclusion and marginalisation because of their status criminally responsible for their situation? And how do we begin to address it? So this is an issue I want to look at through the lens of the decriminalisation of petty offences. So when I'm talking about petty offences, I'm speaking to this issue of laws which are criminalising conduct related to the performance of life-sustaining activities in public spaces, various nuisance behaviours, and the segregation, control and restriction of what we can and can't do in public spaces. And some of the more common examples that we see in laws across the continent are being a rogue and vagabond, and I'll look at that in a bit more detail later. Sleeping or loitering in a public space, being idle and disorderly, begging, washing in public, and various forms of solicitation. And here it doesn't just include issues around the criminalisation of sex work as an example, but it also includes those who work in the informal sector, so hawkers, vendors and traders. And the reason there's a concern about this is that these laws raise significant human rights issues and raise issues about the effectiveness of policing in terms of their enforcement. So in terms of the evidence tells us that they're discriminatory. So we've got a lot of research from across the continent that shows that the laws indirectly discriminate against some of the most marginalised in our society, because these are the people, those living rough, who are homeless or who are plying their trade on the streets. They're more likely to engage in the prohibited conduct given their socio-economic circumstances and their reliance on the informal sector. And the laws are often framed in terms that are so broad that it's very difficult to ascertain exactly what conduct is being prohibited, which, with a broad discretion then given to the police in terms of interpreting and applying their powers of enforcement, we see them used improperly against certain sectors of our community, such as people who use drugs, sex workers, people with mental health issues, the homeless, street children, etc., as a way to punish and to control their use of public space. These laws contribute to overcrowding in places of detention, and we have research from countries like Nigeria and Kenya where these petty offences account for up to 60% of people awaiting trial. I've already mentioned that the laws are overly broad and vague, but they also divert scarce policing resources away from more serious forms of crime. So here I'm thinking about issues around sort of frustration by police, and in research done by the Open Society, the police describe frustration in which they're called to engage and detain people under these laws who clearly need other forms of social support or assistance, and police also expressing a frustration at this so-called revolving door phenomena, where people are arrested, detained and released on these offences only to be arrested again, because we're not addressing, and the punitive approach to the enforcement of these laws is not addressing the underlying causes. These laws are not new, although there are exceptions to that, but they have colonial origins, and there's been a lot of conversation on our continent about the need to decolonise our policing and to decolonise our criminal procedure, and this is part of that discourse. And so these laws are evident from French Portuguese laws from the 14th century, and these vagrancy offences are seen not just on our continent, but a similar pattern has been followed in Africa, but the Indian subcontinent, the Caribbean, Australia, the Americas, as it did in Britain, France, Spain and Portugal. And the underlying purpose of these laws was to ensure class and racial segregation, to control who used and who could access those public spaces, and to curb the effect of urbanisation on cities and the urban elite. And when we look at the impact the modern impact of the enforcement of these laws, we're seeing the same type of purpose and impact. So they were mainly coming in terms of the Southern Africa, where I'm speaking to you from. The English Vagrancy Act of 1824 created offences like idle disorderly, rogue and vagabond, loitering with an intent to commit an arrestable offence, and offences against public decency and morality. Now, that 1824 Act has really diminished in authority in the UK over the years, and in 2003, I think it was when finally idle and disorderly was no longer an arrestable offence. But this act, which has influenced the penal codes across Africa, still remains in play across our continent. So despite dramatic changes in our society and our police's understanding of vagrancy-related offences and the futility of punitive criminal justice approaches to policing poverty and social exclusion, there's been very little movement on our continent to actually repeal and amend these laws. This is just an example of some of the countries in Southern Africa where these laws exist on the statutes. Rogue and vagabond and idle and disorderly are still in the books and are still enforced. But even where we've seen laws amended, where we've got modern penal codes and criminal procedure acts, we're still seeing laws with the same intent and purpose retained. And we've got an example of that in South Africa with the municipal bylaws, which are used to achieve this same effect. So why do we retain these laws? And one of the biggest challenges here is that we need to sort of think, what is the purpose of the laws? Is it a legitimate purpose? And does their enforcement meet that legitimate purpose? And if the often repeated argument for retaining them is that they're useful in terms of a crime prevention approach, and that they allow the police to target a range of potentially problematic behaviours. But these assumptions about crime prevention value of these offences is actually uncritically repeated, despite mounting evidence that it's not the case, that the enforcement of these offences are not making our communities safer. There is the beginning of a movement on the African continent to begin to promote decriminalising these offences. The case of Mayeso Gwanda in the state, which was a Malawi High Court case of 2017, really got this discussion going. And I want to end my presentation with this as a very brief case study. So Mayeso Gwanda was, or is still, a vendor. He sells plastic bags in a town close to the village where he works. And at 4 o'clock one morning, he was walking from his village into town with the plastic bags on his way to market to sell. And he was stopped by the police, asked what he was doing. He said, "I'm on my way to the market to sell." He was asked to give a bribe to the police. He refused to do that. And he was then arrested and charged with being a rogue and a vagabond. He spent 3 days in police custody before he was bailed, and he was given legal assistance by partners of ours in Malawi to challenge the constitutionality of this rogue and vagabond law. And what the court found in this case was that, we've gone too many. The court found that rogue and vagabond is unconstitutional in terms of modern constitutional protections which reflect international law legal provisions. This law is unconstitutional on the basis that it violates the right to dignity. It doesn't comply with the rule of law because the law itself is drafted in a way that is very broad and very vague. Rogue and vagabond is every person found near or upon a premises or any road or highway in a public space at such a time and in such circumstances that to lead to the conclusion that the person is there for an illegal or disorderly purpose. I mean, it's impossible to know what conduct is going to lead to an arrest under this. And the court also made a very important statement about the problematic nature of these types of arrests. You can't arrest for behaviour that's not in fact criminal. It amounts to inhumane and degrading treatment. It violates the rights to freedom and security of the person, freedom from discrimination. And they're seeing that these type of laws are being disproportionately applied to the poor. Justice Calambera emphasised that the police can't just randomly arrest people. We need evidence-based policing, intelligence-led policing, where we can indicate and demonstrate a person had an intention to commit a criminal offence. And Justice Ntaba said that we need, in terms of dealing with minor offences, alternatives to arrest and detention, because we're seeing this contribution to overcrowding. So this case is not just isolated to Malawi. It really began a continental movement to promote the decriminalisation of arbitrary and to reduce arbitrary arrest on the basis of poverty and on the basis of status. And I'm going to end my presentation here, and I understand my colleague Tem from the Open Society Initiative for West Africa is going to take you through these developments with a focus on issues around COVID-19, the creation of new petty offences and their impact.
Thank you, Louise, and sorry for cutting you short. I think it's a very important subject, and we would all love to listen to more details on these cases. But I think it's great to hear the next speaker that will continue presenting some of the challenges. So Mr. Tem Mbu from the Open Society Justice Initiative, who is an Equality, Justice and Human Rights Program Officer in the office in Dakar, Senegal, will present more aspects as concerns the cost of excessive criminalization of petty offences. And Tam, you only have 7 minutes, just a reminder. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anna, and thank you, Louise, too. Can I just make sure that everybody can see my presentation? Is that the case?
Yes, we can see it.
All right. Thank you. So my name is Tem Mbu, and I work with the Open Society Initiative for West Africa based in Dakar, Senegal, and I'm really happy to be here today. Now, my colleague Louise has given a background to how police petty offences came to find themselves in the judicial arsenal of most of our countries. What I will do in this presentation is to delve a bit deeper into the impact that the continued enforcement of these offences has had during the pandemic. Now, this is not to say that before the pandemic, arrests for petty offences were non-existent. On the contrary, the pandemic has simply exposed the perniciousness of arrest for life-sustaining activities and has really further entrenched the marginalization of millions of people on the continent who are already struggling from the legacies of many failed economic, social, and legal policies. Admittedly, COVID-19 caught almost all of us unaware, and of course, law enforcement agencies were no exception. And this explains to a large extent the kind of haphazard and the response that we had to the pandemic. Now, in a bid to reduce the spread of the virus, many African countries deployed a range of extraordinary measures which had very damaging effects on those who rely on daily earnings, such as hawkers, street workers, commercial bike riders, taxi people, and a lot of other vulnerable groups. The pandemic really just magnified structural weaknesses within the continent's criminal justice systems, which has now spiraled into a kind of human rights crisis. Now, this pandemic has had very specific impact on vulnerable people, and the criminalization of the response has had very far-reaching consequences. Now you will notice that a plethora of new petty offences were created as part of the pandemic response. These petty offences ranged from breaking lockdown rules, curfews, not wearing a face mask, leaving your house, buying alcohol or cigarettes. And evidently, these disproportionately affect those who come from the poorest and most marginalized echelons of a society and are least equipped to deal with the in 3 cases of the criminal justice system, they are also very unlikely to be able to afford the 3 Bs, bail, bribe, or barrister. And while these measures might have been legitimate to begin with, very limited consideration was given to context, proportionality, and some of the knock-on effects that these measures could have. Now, traditional approaches to crime prevention and law enforcement rely very heavily on custodial arrest and jail time on the continent. But the current crisis, during the current crisis, these approaches to law enforcement are most likely to cause more public harm than they prevent. The criminalization of the pandemic response without careful consideration of the fact that arrests pose a serious risk of infection both to police officers and to suspects and arrestees is something that really needs to be seriously interrogated. Now, for instance, in South Africa, now I'm talking about mass arrest, the Disaster Management Act, which was introduced as part of the response to the pandemic, created a lot of petty offenses which have had very tangible effect in terms of how it exposed a lot of poor people to mass arrest. In August 2020 alone in South Africa, over 300,000 people were arrested and fined for very minor infringements like being outdoors without a permit, being in possession of alcohol, or being in possession of a cigarette without dated labels. Now, a lot of these arrested persons were detained in already overcrowded detention centers, and this only increased the risk of transmission of the disease and further compounded the problems of the criminal justice chain. Whether or not these arrests were justified, it is admittedly traumatic for any person who is arrested following a spur of the moment decision by a police officer. I mean, arrest in itself is very traumatic. Now, another major cause for concern during the pandemic is that a lot of these poor people who are arrested and detained now have a criminal record, which of course has a lifetime impact, especially on their job prospects. This will obviously just entrench their marginalization again. Now, it should be noted that while these large-scale arrests were going on, the services of the judiciary in some countries like Uganda were suspended under pandemic directives, and this has had a very deep impact on access to justice for a lot of people, again, especially those most vulnerable. As Louise has mentioned in her presentation, petty offences laws confer a lot of discretionary powers on the police and increase the exposure of people already living in poverty to abuse, harassment, corruption, extortion, and like by law enforcement. And this was especially true at the height of the pandemic, where the police in many circumstances were unprepared for the securitized response to the pandemic. This unpreparedness manifested itself in many instances of police brutality and excesses. Now, in Kenya, for instance, over 2,500 cases of police brutality were documented, and all of this related to the enforcement of pandemic regulations. 15 people were killed by the police during the door-to-door lockdown in Kenya, and in Nigeria, police violence claimed the lives of more people in the first months of the pandemic, more than the pandemic itself. Now, arresting poor people en masse is really the easier thing to do, but studies have shown that this is not financially viable. It is not necessarily the most cost-effective way of fighting crime, especially during a pandemic. It certainly also is not the most judicious use of police time and resources. It also certainly does not help to enhance positive police community relationships. The systematic recourse to arrest for petty offences to solve complex social challenges is often justified on the grounds of public safety and order. And obviously, we all aspire to live in healthy and free communities that are free of crime. But there has been no causal link that has been established between heightened criminalization of life-sustaining activities, which petty offenses do, and the greater public safety. Now, the law enforcement challenges in policing petty offenses witnessed during the pandemic lends a lot of credence to the campaign for the decriminalization of petty offenses that my colleague Louise mentioned, which is going on the continent. And in this slide, I'm just going to outline 3 aspects of that campaign, which has changed the dynamic in terms of the enforcement of petty offenses laws across the continent. Now, there's been civil society mobilization across the region for the past almost a decade, where we've had a broad-based coalition of civil society organizations come together under the banner of the campaign to decriminalize petty offenses in Africa. And this coalition has been undertaking research, doing documentation, undertaking strategic litigation and advocacy for policy reform at the national, regional, and international levels. Thanks to some of this advocacy, research, and strategic litigation, we've now had the African Commission on Human and People's Rights adopt guidelines on the decriminalization of police petty offenses in Africa. Now, these guidelines provide a Pan-African roadmap for reform and establishes standards against which laws must be assessed for their human rights compliance, and to assess as well whether the guide states on measures that they need to take to ensure that these laws do not target persons on a discriminatory basis. Also, our partners in the campaign for the decriminalization of petty offenses introduced in 2018 a request before the African Court on Human and People's Rights to ask the court to determine whether petty offenses were vagrancy laws in particular were in compliance with the African Charter on Human and People's Rights. And in December of 2020, the court came out with an advisory opinion holding that these laws violate the African Charter, the protocol to the African Charter on the Rights of Women in Africa, and the African Charter on the Rights and Welfare of the Child. And it places a positive obligation on states to reform their criminal law in order to eradicate such practices. Now, it is interesting to note that in its submission to the African Court on Human and People's Rights, Burkina Faso argued that the governments across the continent should respond to vagrancy laws with social rather than penal interventions. I think this is very, very important, an argument of this kind made by the state. And it's also noteworthy that countries such as Angola, Cape Verde, Kenya, Lesotho, Mozambique, and Zimbabwe have taken the laudable step of repealing their vagrancy laws, and there are others who are in the process of doing so. Now, this groundswell of action from African citizens, governments, and human rights institutions on the continent places an onus on the police and law enforcement, as well as criminal justice institutions, to start doing things differently. We need to look at alternatives to dealing with issues around safety, public safety, and crime, which does not include arrests, wanton arrests, and custodial sentences for issues that are essentially economic and social in nature. Thank you very much. I think my time is up.
Yes, I didn't want to cut you because I think you made some very important points which really open up to the next set of speakers. So obviously some of these issues are not in the hands of the police when it comes to decriminalizing certain offenses, for instance, but I think, as you said, some of it is in the hands also of the police. And we will now have 3 speakers from different two from Africa and another expert from the Policing and Human Rights Network. speak about some of the answers to the challenges that we've heard about. First up is Assistant Inspector General David Birech, who is the Director of Reforms of the National Police Service in Kenya. He will speak on some of the lessons learned in the police reform in Kenya, which has already been going on since a number of years after the Constitution of 2010, but also update us on some of the specifics relating to COVID-19 responses. Again, I'm sorry to give you very short time, but David Birech, if you have, you can take the floor and try to stick to 7 minutes if possible. Thank you so much. The floor is yours, Assistant Inspector General. You have to unmute yourself, please.
Thank you,
Yes.
Anna, for the opportunity to participate in this discussion. As you have rightly said, my name is David Birech from the National Police Service in Kenya. I'm the Director of Police Reforms. The journey of police reforms started way back, but in the year 2007 is when it picked its pace. This was, for those who can remember, this was after the 2007 general elections that were held in Kenya, after which, when the results were announced, the same results were contested and violence broke out. Post-election violence of 2007, 2008 broke out in the city and other major cities, and around 1,200 people unfortunately lost their lives. After the aftermath of that violence, and after the principals were brought in to form a coalition government, a committee of inquiry was established to look at the causes of the post-election violence. And one of the recommendations that this Commission of Inquiry pointed out was the issue of police professional misconduct by the Kenya police, and therefore the need to reform the service was put more emphasis. As a result of this, a task force was formed to reform the police service in Kenya, and this task force was chaired by retired Judge Philip Ransley from South Africa. Between 2008 and 2009, they visited most of the affected regions in the Republic of Kenya, and after concluding their report, they made over 200 recommendations concerning police reforms. And then after that, an implementation committee was formed to implement the recommendations of the Ransley report. During that time, 2010 is when Kenya promulgated the Constitution of Kenya 2010. And most of the recommendations that were in the Ransley report were adopted in the Constitution. So when the implementation committee came, they were able to condense the over 200 recommendations into 4 pillars. And these pillars were: 1, legislative, policy and institutional reforms. Those were the areas to do with, enactment of new acts to govern the police, new acts to create, like for instance, the National Police Service was created after the 2010 Constitution. There was also a Police Service Commission which was created to look under the welfare of the police service. Then there was also the establishment of Internal Affairs Unit, which is a unit within the National Police Service, but a unit that deals with police excesses and misconduct after they have been committed by the officers. And then the 2010 Constitution also recommended the establishment of the Internal Oversight, Independent Policing Oversight Authority, IPOA. Again, these two institutions, IPOA and Internal Affairs Unit, are the major authorities that investigate police excesses. Then we had also the third pillar, which was police professionalism. Under this, a new training curriculum for the basic police officers was developed. Another one for senior officers, strategic management course was also developed. And then the final pillar was on administrative, operational preparedness, that is to do with issues of logistical capacity, issues of tooling and kitting the police service. Last year, because of the same recommendations, the National Police Service changed their uniform. Now they have a new uniform, which came out as one of those recommendations, which was meant to give it a new face. So as we speak now, we have those two institutions that check on police excesses. The Internal Affairs Unit is an independent unit that sits outside police premises. The officers are not within police buildings. They have also established anonymous reporting system whereby anybody who is aggrieved by any member of the service can be able to report anonymously on their cases, and the same will be followed up. So, in a nutshell, those are some of the reforms that have taken place and that are still going on in the National Police Service. Now, coming on to the second part of the presentation, which is policing during COVID-19 pandemic and some of the interventions. As most of the speakers have agreed or stated in their remarks, it is true that the COVID-19 pandemic was unprecedented. It brought challenges to policing organizations, just like it did to other private and public organizations. It's something that nobody was prepared for, and therefore there was a lot of challenges, as some of which my colleagues have mentioned, issues to do with curfew orders, cessation of movements into and out of certain regions, lack of PPEs for the officers who are receiving complainants coming to make their cases. There are also discrimination, stigma on the officers and the members of the public who were affected or infected by the pandemic. There was also fear and ignorance, propaganda being propagated by people that even right now, currently, when people are being asked to be vaccinated, there are a lot of stories that if you are vaccinated and you have not paired a child, you will not be able to, such kind of unfounded fears. As the speaker from Nigeria mentioned, it is true that on the initial stages when COVID started, the officers reacted differently. And as a result, we had members of the public who were injured. Some were killed by officers who were overzealous with the instructions that they had been given to apprehend the curfew breakers. So we had a lot of people being arrested for the petty offences, like the first speaker has alluded to. And our cells normally are not meant for those huge numbers. So there was overcrowding to the extent that in Nairobi at some point, people who had been arrested were taken to quarantine and a temporary court established in a stadium to be able to hear their cases. But at some point, also during the initial time, the courts stopped for some time. And when they had stopped, the police still were doing the arrest, and they had to find a way of, putting these people. But luckily, there were some interventions, like in June last year, the Inspector General issued directives to the officers that petty offenders should not be placed in custody, but they should be given free bail to appear in court on the dates that the courts would be able to hear. So lessons learned, what have we learned during this time of the pandemics? Issues of e-learning. For instance, in Kenya, with the help of UNODC, we were able to develop short courses which were run through e-learning to help the officers, be able to be sensitized on issues to do with gender-based violence, how to handle them, issues of the use of force and firearm, bail and bond, human rights, how to observe human rights while controlling crowds, how to handle interest groups, understanding diversion, and decision to charge. These were short modules. There were 7 in number, which were able to help the officers to learn very quickly, so that they could be able to, get that knowledge, because physical training was not foreseeable. Therefore, this is something which I think is also during the COVID pandemic. I want to link that e-learning or virtual meetings to last year, the East African Heads of Police Chiefs, the organization in the East African region, they were to have their annual general meeting, which is normally physical, but because of the pandemic, they also adopted a virtual meeting, and it brings up members of about 14 member countries. So those are the 2 positive things that I think, despite the pandemic being around, it has come as a disguise. Some of the intervention again include releasing suspects on bail and encouraging officers to be vaccinated, issuing officers with PPEs, and also encouraging officers where they are not very busy. They work in groups. If they are 6, 2 officers can work in a shift. When they go back, the 2 will come, or the 2 can work for a week. The next week, another group will come in. So those are some of the interventions that we have adopted. I can see Anne is maybe.
Yes,
Anne
I think we've run out of time, unfortunately, but thank you so much. I think there were some really important points made, both in terms of decisions from police senior management, the Inspector General, and some of the opportunities that this crisis have open in terms of more exchange online and training online. We will go to the next speaker, hoping that the connection will work. So Dr. Funsola Sowemimo from Nigeria is a former commissioner of police, medical commissioner of police. She's retired last year, and she will speak about promoting a public health response into policing COVID-19. Doctor, can you hear us?
Can you hear me?
Yes, great.
Oh,
please go ahead. Thank you.
So let me just rush through. Thank you very much. I really appreciate being invited. So my topic today is promoting a public health response into policing COVID-19. We know that Nigeria, of course, is the largest Black nation, and we have a very large population. So when in March we had COVID, we had the first case of COVID-19, we went into the lockdowns, the restrictions, which were both with the international standards, and the police were very involved in this respect. And we also did follow the guidelines at the national level, and we also put in our own restrictions internally. For example, in the police, the headquarters, we restricted visitors to the headquarters. Even the Inspector General was not entertaining large entourages. So you would be like 2 or 3, and with the social distancing. And of course, he had a document which we presented before, in which even those with petty offences were restricted. We said we had to restrict arrests because we could not fill our detention rooms. Also, in the police, we had training, and there was a lot of training and creation of awareness for the general duty and the medical police officers. When we had to, because this lockdown brought in a lot of issues, because when you talk about arrest, you cannot arrest somebody from afar. So you have to, there had to be a lot of training. And want to thank the United Nations Office of Drugs and Crime, who assisted us in developing a guideline, which was widely celebrated for being at the right time and giving the right information to both those in general duty and in the medical. The collaborations we had, of course, we said at the international level, we had the collaboration with the United Nations. At the national level, the Nigeria Police Medical Officers were on the national team, the COVID-19 response team. At each state level, we were also put there with other law enforcement agents, not only the police. So there was a lot of integration, because they knew that with this lockdown, enforcement of lockdown was number one. But within the police, we also needed, because the police and the law enforcement agents are a very large community. Offhand, we usually would say our police office, the police community is over 300,000. And then you talk about the families. So that is even going to almost 1 million all over the country. And we're in every state and local government. So they needed a lot of training, and a lot of awareness had to be created. So being in the teams, collaborating with the different agencies was very important. And of course, we had private sector in which we there were a lot of donations. PPEs were donated. However, within the police themselves, the police organization, the police, tailoring unit developed. We can't call it develop, but we had masks, and these masks had, as I said, all other law enforcement agents did that too, with the particular police logo. So we had to make masks. The police medical also went into the making hand sanitizers, and at each police formation we had wash hand basins, and so there was a lot of awareness created, and we tried as much as possible. Of course, there were a lot of challenges, but as much as possible, the police force from the hierarchy, the top hierarchy, were very particular about ensuring that these restrictions were adhered to. As is well known, and in other countries we had challenges. first of all, we had, well, not first of all, but there was already an ongoing insecurity issue in the country, which has extended. We had insecurity in all the areas of the country, and this was, you know, even increased. We had, of course, we've heard of the kidnappings, we've heard of the targeting of the law enforcement officers. So these, and we had the very well-known celebrated NSAS riots, which we had a lot of police formations being burnt down, and this also brought challenges to this public health response, because most of the police officers now had nowhere to even stay because of this issue, and it was causing a lot of issues. So we had there was a lack of adequate measures to take care of the police officers, and this has been very challenging. The vaccination, which has been ongoing, the Inspector General made sure that he, you know, got his vaccination publicly and sent it all around, and each state commissioner was, you know, had his own vaccination. There was, you know, a lot of fanfare, so that people were encouraged to get their vaccines. But we know the vaccines are not yet enough, but there's a lot of pressure to ensure that at least the police and their families, because, you know, the one area we have policemen, we also have their families, so we need to. And one of the collaborations we had was that at each state government ensured that at least 1 or 2 centers, vaccination centers, were in police commands. So that allowed more police officers to gain access and, you know, be able to get their vaccines. So, and even the retired officers, and that was very, very good. So even now, as we're getting the next, the Moderna doses, we still have them being given out in police form. Not, as I said, it's law enforcement, but I would, you know, stick to the policing. So that has been a very good line by the government. For the next steps, we are really hoping that the training will continue, and we hope that we'll be able to maintain this figure, because using the face mask has, you know, it's not been that easy, even though we have been trying to, you know, ensure that enough face masks are given. But, you know, it's something we need to continually educate them on. And the arrests, you know, we still have to, you know, give a lot of education. So there's a lot of health education. We're trying to ensure that while they're in colleges, we also want to see how we can do this. And we're trying to set up in the medical first aid officers who would be able to create awareness and give as much health education as possible. Thank you so much. I know my time is up. Thank you very much. I really want to appreciate the HONLEA and also the Global Law Enforcement and Public Health. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, and thank you for sticking to the time. That's very much appreciated. I think you gave us a lot of information of interesting initiatives and important measures taken in Nigeria during this period of COVID pandemic. The last speaker is Mr. Jason Q from the Thames Valley Police. He's the Chief Inspector in charge of the Thames Valley Violence Reduction Unit, and I'll let him talk instead of giving a longer introduction. Thank you, Jason.
Thank you very much, and thank you for having me. So I'm a Chief Inspector in the UK's second largest police service, and we cover Windsor, Oxford, and Reading and Milton Keynes as our largest urban centres. So I was prepped to cover many aspects of COVID-19 and the challenges that COVID-19 brought us here in the UK, with some parallels to the international experience too. But many of those have been covered already, particularly within the last presentation, which is really handy actually, because my passion lies in decriminalisation and the harms that prohibition or punitive policing can cause unintended consequences within our communities. So over policing, as we saw in certain circumstances during COVID, can actually cause more harm than good. Although obviously the ethos is about harm reduction and crime prevention, obviously policing has to be really delicate and find a really delicate balance about how to look after our communities whilst also looking after ourselves as well. And some of the main challenges during COVID were we really needed to identify our key stakeholders. We need to work really closely with public health and let health lead. So more often than not, police are seen as the leaders in society and in crisis, but actually our health leaders were the absolute people in the lead here and had the knowledge. Our job, our role needed to shift, and we needed to police sensitively. One of the main consequences of COVID was the over-policing of the most marginalising communities. An example of which would be, how could a vaccine be obtainable to someone without an address? So if a homeless individual living on cardboard was missed because they simply were invisible to a doctor, to family members, etc. How would the vaccine message get to that person? So we really need to think differently about those people most marginalised in society. Also priorities for PPE. This is a delicate balance here. Many police officers, many people in nursing and health, and people right at the front line, looking after people who were being affected by COVID-19 were falling ill themselves. However, there was a real balance to be struck with people working in the front line, such as a shop. What right did a police officer have over someone working in a supermarket, for instance, where food and the obtaining food was just as important as a police role? So we're all in this together. The pandemic taught us many lessons here, and it's about being together, about being building that trust and confidence of our communities. So one of the key challenges was to avoid over policing. Now, when the lockdowns occurred, we needed to be really sensitive about how we policed the lockdown. The over policing occurred in the most densely populated areas. So in blocks of flats where thousands of people lived within a very short proximity, that area was largely over policed, whereas the more affluent areas where properties were spread out, policing didn't occur there. And yet the people living in the affluent areas seemed to be living their normal lives, congregating, meeting neighbours, meeting family members, for instance, because it was unseen by law enforcement. Yet all of the pressure was placed upon those people living in the most densely populated areas. How is it equitable? How is it fair that someone lives in an apartment that has no garden, has no access to outside space, yet was being enforced by legislation to stay indoors, when actually they were being over policed, when the people who had access to space, access to gardens, were allowed out to freely live their lives? It just wasn't fair, it wasn't equitable. So policing needed to recognise those challenges and respond accordingly. Just very lastly, there are many parallels to policing COVID to policing drugs as well. We can cause untold damage by taking a punitive enforcement approach. We need to think differently, but above all, we need to work sensitively. A public health approach is the only way to really gain the trust and confidence of our communities. I know it's really quick, really garbled, and I really want to expand a lot more on what I've just said, and I'm happy to do so through contact. But thank you very much, Anna.
Thank you so much, Jason, for also being short but specific. I had a presentation prepared. I'm not going to go through the whole presentation. I will just show you one slide, and then In the meantime, if participants, attendees want to ask questions or make comments, you can write in the chat or raise your hand. We'll take a few minutes for questions before we end. So I'll just share the one slide, which is basically to present UNODC tools and publications in the area of police reform. And I will share the link in the chat as well for all of you to go and check out our website. So briefly to say, some of the relevant tools that we've produced are specific guidance relating to COVID, access to justice, prisons, and other related issues. We have a number of handbooks that are relevant to many of the questions that have been raised today, including as it relates to treatment of people with drug use disorders and alternatives, police accountability, use of force, early access to legal aid, so access to legal aid in police stations and so on. And just the last point, we are working on finalizing e-learning modules on non-coercive investigative interviewing and associated safeguards, and a practical resource toolkit for professional human rights compliant policing, together with the Convention Against Torture Initiative. And as I said, I'll share the link to our website webpage in the chat. Are there any questions or comments at this point? I guess we've exhausted any participants at this stage. So I don't see any hands or any comments in the chat. I would like to give the floor to Valérie Leveau for some final remarks. And in the meantime, if someone comes up with a question, don't hesitate to write in the chat. Valérie, thank you for being here and listening.
Thank you, Anna. I have to thank you. I would like also to thank our partner in this event, APCOV, and all the panelists for the presentations they have delivered. I must say I enjoyed the discussions very much. I think they have contributed to building the knowledge of UNODC and of law enforcement experts from Africa and beyond on what evidence-based, human rights-based and public health-based policing means. The event has covered a very broad ground. We have heard about the negative impact of petty offences laws on policing, on pre-trial detention, on prison overcrowding, on the discriminatory targeting of marginalized people. We have heard about the welcome trend towards repealing these laws and the lessons learned from policing during the pandemic in Kenya, Nigeria, the UK, with only 100 new wave of petty offences created in that context, new risk of over-policing, new challenges in policing. And I found those discussions very interesting and relevant beyond Africa. I must say, being based in Europe, I recognize many of the problematic aspects of policing during the pandemic, also in Europe. So to conclude, what I would like to do is to emphasize the need to continue strengthening these types of exchanges at regional level and also at inter-regional level among policy makers, civil society, communities, law enforcement officials, in order to build human rights-based and evidence-based policing adapted to the needs of Africa and other continents. And finally, I would like to thank all participants in this event for joining the event at the end of a long day, and would like to encourage any participants who would feel this is appropriate to reach out to UNODC to share their knowledge, their experiences, as well as any needs for assistance in the areas that were covered by today's side event. And to conclude, allow me to thank my colleague Anna for being the driving force behind this event on the side of UNODC Justice Section, as well as all colleagues involved behind the scenes in ensuring that the logistic of the event goes smoothly, which was the case. So thank you, everyone. And it was really an enriching conversation for myself. Thank you.
Thank you everyone, and we will end the meeting now if no other questions come up. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.